Hi, everyone. Welcome to What About Grief? I'm Larry Holm. Recently, I was at a weekend get-together with about 60 of my fraternity brothers from college. It's a yearly gathering for anyone who can make it, and it is graciously hosted by Matt at his log cabin home. Hopefully, we didn't do too much damage to it. It's a time for me to connect with guys I haven't seen since college, and we can look back and laugh about our times at Baylor University, as well as get caught up on each other's lives. It is fascinating to see where life has taken us all since graduation. So many twists and turns, highs and lows. In fact, last season I interviewed one of my fraternity brothers, Doug Hoffpower, on the loss of his son Zach at the young age of 26. If you have ever lost a child, make sure to go back and listen to Doug's interview as he shares some heartfelt advice with a dose of humor. But what was interesting and surprising to me over the weekend was hearing from some of my friends how much they enjoyed listening to the podcast each month and thanking me for how helpful it has been. That really meant a lot to me, since I often wonder if this podcast is having an effect on those who are dealing with grief. Are people relating to the topics we cover and the guests we speak with? After my wife Sarah passed away, I was searching for a way I could celebrate or honor her life. She was always a person who helped others, put others first, made time for people, and was a gracious host with an infectious smile. When thoughts about starting a podcast began swirling in my head, I realized that I wanted it to be a resource for those who are navigating their own grief journeys. I wanted to help people realize they do not have to walk alone with their grief. Also to honor Sarah's life and keep her memory alive to those who knew and loved her. My guest this month also lost a spouse, and since that time has taken up a cause to help others as a way to honor her late husband. Kim Witczak lost her husband Woody to suicide due to an undisclosed side effect of an antidepressant he was taking in 2003. She now is a leading global drug safety advocate and speaker with over 25 years professional experience in advocacy, advertising, and marketing communications. She is also a very vocal consumer representative on the FDA Advisory Committee evaluating new drugs coming to market. As she'll tell you herself, she isn't anti-drug. Rather, she is pro-information. And in her efforts to honor Woody's life and help others, she continues to stand up to the big pharma and FDA machines to demand honesty, transparency, reform, and accountability. So with all that, Kim, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks, Larry. I'm excited to have this conversation.
I am too. So let's get right into it. I always like to start out because we didn't know your husband, Woody. What was he like? Describe his personality. Paint a picture of Woody for us.
Oh my gosh. Woody was super funny. Woody was outgoing. Woody loved life. He was in sales. He was always the guy that would walk into a room and you felt his energy. He had big personality and he was also just super kind. And, one of the things that people at his memorial service talked about is when Woody was talking to you, he literally, you were the only person. He wasn't one of these guys that was looking around the room trying to see if, there's somebody better to talk to. And so that's what I remember of Woody and he was funny and he was like my best friend.
Oh, that's sweet. How did you two meet and when were you married?
Yeah, the two of us, we met actually on my birthday in Chicago at a bar. He went to DePaul University. I went to school up in Lake Forest, Illinois, and it was at Kelly's Pub. My friends were throwing me a birthday party, and it was funny. I was waiting in line to go to the bathroom, and I saw these guys that had a Minnesota sweatshirt on. So I'm like, "Oh my God, you're from Minnesota!" Doing the Minnesota thing. And he turned around, and he's like, "Oh my God, you are from Minnesota." He pretended he was from Minnesota, but he really wasn't. And so he was so cute and charming. And I remember we chatted for a little while and I'm like, I'll be back. I got to go get cheese fries, because who doesn't eat cheese fries?
Yeah,
and so,
I'm all for that.
And his friends are like, she's not coming back. I did because he was super funny. And that was June 1st, my birthday. And we were together pretty much our first date 2 days later. And then we got married in October of 1993.
Wow. Cool story. So let's get into Woody a little bit more here and what happened. from what I've read, he began a new job as a VP with a startup company, which sounds exciting, and it sounds like it fits his personality from what you just told me. But he was experiencing some sleepless nights. Why the sleepless nights, and what happened from there?
Sure. So Wood had just started his dream job with a startup company, and he was super excited because Woody was like, he was recycling before recycling was a thing. And
Mm,
this was an energy efficient lighting company. And he had always worked at, he worked in pharmaceutical sales, he worked in retail sales, but this was the first time that he was going to do something on his own. And he always said, I want to be paid for on my performance. And so this was really exciting. And we also, but with that, with, a startup company, he got paid when he sold, and it was a new
mm,
company. And so, I think there was some anxiety of, like, waking up in the middle of the night, like, just when are we going to start making business? I mean, and really, I always say, like, sleepless nights as an entrepreneur are not that uncommon, right? It's
sure,
pretty common.
sure.
And so I think he was a guy that literally needed 8 hours of sleep. Like, we'd be at dinner parties, and if he was tired, he would just literally fall asleep. So the fact that Woody wasn't sleeping was actually something that bothered him. And so he went and saw his doctor. And it's his doctor that he has seen, his adult life, the one that he would go every year. I mean, he was a really good patient. He was a military kid, and, you respect authorities. And he was also an athlete. And so I always say that Woody was kind of your Humpty Dumpty, meaning he would always say, doctors don't get paid enough because they fixed him, they put his knee
Mm.
back together. And so that's what he did. He went and saw his doctor.
His doctor prescribed the antidepressant Zoloft, which at that time, correct me if I'm wrong, was FDA approved and sold as safe and effective, correct?
Correct. It was,
Okay.
yeah. So he was given that Zoloft, which I'm not even sure he even knew what it really was. But, the
Mm.
doctor said, take this and it'll take the edge off and help you sleep. And he gave him a 3-week sample pack of Zoloft, which automatically doubled the dose after week 1. So, at that point, nothing was out of the norm. Your doctor gives you something, you take it.
Hmm. Trust.
Yep, trust.
Yeah. And from what you know now, was this the case of a doctor prescribing this drug due to a relationship maybe with a pharmaceutical maker, or did he really believe that this would help him and maybe didn't know the side effects how it might relate to Woody in his case?
Now if you were to ask me that question, I would think, there are relationships between pharma and the drug companies and doctors, and that's how they, get performed or get paid, number of prescriptions, etc. At this time, I truly believe that the doctor had no idea. Remember, this is 2003.
Hmm.
Everything was advertised. You had all the Paxil, all the Zoloft being advertised as safe and effective. And so I don't think that there was anything. I think the doctor truly, at that point, they were doing big drug company education of doctors. And that is the one thing I have learned is a lot of the education that doctors get, especially GPs, the general practitioners, are really being educated by pharmaceutical sales reps.
So I want to read a paragraph from your website and have you unpack it afterwards. Quote, shortly before Woody died, Kim found him curled up in a fetal position on the kitchen floor, holding his head like a vice, crying, help me, help me. I don't know what is happening to me. I am losing my mind. It's like my head is outside my body looking in. We calmed him down and called his doctor, who said you need to give it 4 to 6 weeks for the drug to kick in. Over the next week, Woody, optimistically, was looking for ways to beat this feeling in his head. So when I read that the first time, I think the word that popped into my head was helplessness. Like, here is Woody on the floor, and this drug seems all consuming and taking over, his brain, his thoughts. I'm sure it's accelerating his anxiety. Were you all just kind of wondering, why is this happening?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The first 3 weeks that Woody was put on the drug, I was actually out of the country. And so I
Mm,
didn't see him. And so I was like really excited to have, come home and be at home. And it was really Woody walked in the back door, fell to the floor, and he was like driving around telling me that he was his head outside his body. And I remember looking at him going, oh, like I've never seen this before. And I don't
right.
think we ever even questioned the drug. I think, I'm like, Wood, if we prayed, we breathed, we did yoga. I'm like, I don't know, maybe you need to like have some pot. Like I was just trying to think of all these different
Hmm.
ways of beating this feeling in his head. And so ultimately he did call his doctor, and the doctor said you got to give the drug 4 to 6 weeks to kick in. So I don't think I ever even questioned it and never thought again about it. And even every night the next week, Wood he was always optimistic, and he came home and he's like, what do you think about acupuncture? I'm going to beat this feeling. And then it was like, what do you think about hypnosis? I mean, he was looking at all these ways to beat
Hmm.
this feeling in his head. And, looking back, obviously we'll get into it, but, I don't think we ever even questioned anything to do with the drug. And I'm not even sure what he ever thought it was the drug, but he did report that side effect to his doctor.
Yeah. Did it help him sleep?
No, that's the funny
Yeah.
thing. It
Oh,
didn't.
gosh.
Mm-mm, mm-mm.
Mm.
No.
So describe what I'm sure was and is kind of the worst day of your life when Woody took his own life on August 6, 2003, at the age of only 37.
Yeah, when I think back to that day, and I will still like I can go right back there. I was out of town. It was my busy time of my career. I was out on a shoot in Detroit, and you know, I didn't even think twice about leaving, right? So,
Mhm. Sure.
anyways, Wood and I talked all the time. We talked, we woke up in the morning. We both traveled a ton for our job, so it was nothing out of the norm. But I remember I had a really funny dream, and I always remembered my dreams. And Woody always said he didn't dream because he couldn't remember them. So I called him in the
Mm.
morning, and it went right into voicemail. Then I was like, well, and then I called him again, went into voicemail. And then I kept calling and went right into voicemail. And so I was like, that's so weird. Then I sent him, I never heard back. And that has never, even when I was out of town in another country, we still talked, or I would get emails because, texting
Sure.
wasn't really a big time deal then. But
Mhm.
finally I call our voicemail at home, and our voicemail was the partners that Woody was in business with saying, hey, Tim, that was his real name. Where are you? We have a huge meeting tomorrow with Target. Where are you? And I was like, that's weird because Woody is super responsible. And so finally, and I kept calling and I'm sending emails. Where are you? And I've recently found them, and they were panicked emails. And then finally around 8 o'clock my time, I call my dad and I go, hey, Dad, do me a favor. I haven't heard from Woody all day. And, I'm just afraid he might have hit his head. And I'm still in the studio, right, in Detroit.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, my dad went over there. He's like, sure, I'll go check on. And then all of a sudden, my phone rings, and my dad's like, he's like, it's bad. It's bad. I'm like, what do you mean it's bad? And he's like, it's bad. And he goes, and I kept going, like, what do you mean? And I walk out, and I remember being in the back of the studio lot. And he goes, he's dead. And I'm like, what do you mean he's dead? I'm like, what do you mean? How do you know he's dead? And he's like, he's hanging. I'm like, what?
Mm.
Hanging? What? Like it literally in that moment, and I'm sitting there out in the parking lot, and I was in that one phone call, my entire life changed. But I didn't
Mm.
even know what was going on. I was just sitting there going, what? And almost like in shock. And I remember
Yeah.
walking back into the studio, and they're still shooting. I didn't want to call attention to this, like I didn't want anybody to know. And I walk in, and my account person, one of the guys that I worked with, I said, hey, would you do me a favor? I need to go back to the hotel. There's been a family emergency. And I didn't even know what to say. And so we kind of slipped out of the studio, and I get in the car, and I tell my friend Mike, I go, Woody killed himself. And I'm
Mhm.
like, what? And so that night, we're in Detroit. I'm like, how am I getting back to Minneapolis? So all this chaos is going on at my house back in Minneapolis. And I'm trying to figure out how to get home. At this point, everybody at the agency I was working at, Fallon, they knew. They were trying to see, like, do we take a private plane? I mean, obviously getting in a car wasn't going to get me there any
Sure.
time. So eventually that next morning I flew out. But that night, it was all these people calling me, the coroner asking me if he's on any medication. That was the only medication Woody was taking. And I mean, all of this was happening. But let me tell you, that was probably one of the worst night, but also super surreal. Like, what just happened?
Yeah.
What? And I
Yeah.
can, yeah,
Your brain can't comprehend it.
no, no. And especially, I mean, Woody, who loved life, I'm like, he killed himself? Like, I
Right.
literally, it couldn't, everything in me was like, this doesn't even make sense. Are you sure he wasn't killed? That's what I remember, like, thinking. I'm like, this doesn't even remotely make sense.
Was that almost the bigger question than his dying? Like, why? I can't believe that he killed himself.
Yeah, you know what? Everything in me, I was like, what? Like,
Yeah.
wouldn't I? Like I said, we both traveled for work. We always left notes for each other. We always left, or contacted each other or talked all the time. So the fact that, like, there was no note even that night,
Yeah.
he left no note. I'm like, you're going on the biggest, like, trip of your life and you didn't call me. You didn't say anything to me. Like,
Yeah.
what? It literally, and even to this day, that is one thing that still I'm like, how did I even get into this?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
anyways, yeah, that was it was definitely it made literally made no sense because he didn't suffer from depression. He didn't have a history of depression. So had he struggled with this, I would have, maybe I could understand it a little bit, but like literally there was nothing. We just booked our 10-year anniversary trip. We were trying to have kids and we had to go through in vitro. So we had just booked that. We had just booked a trip to Hawaii with his parents. So like everything, like made
Seemed
literally,
normal.
yeah, everything normal. I left and it was just like,
Yeah.
just another August day.
I was able to be with Sarah, my wife, when she passed, which I think has helped me in this whole process, though watching, your loved ones suffer isn't pleasant. But Woody's death it was quick and he was, I assume, by himself and you weren't able to say goodbye. Do you think he maybe waited for you to be out of town?
Yeah,
Have you ever thought of that since?
I don't know. I think personally, I believe that he had another one of those episodes where the head was outside the body, and
Mm,
and when he told me, he goes, "I don't think I can handle another one of these." And so I think there was probably some of that. I also, it's interesting. I didn't get to say goodbye. And that is one of the things that I ultimately, when I came back, it's funny when I met Woody a long time ago, he goes, Kim, when I die, I mean, we had just like maybe 5 years earlier, we did our estate and we did all of our planning and all that because Woody was super like organized. And I
mhm.
remember him saying, you know what, when I die, don't put me in the ground, cremate me. I want my ashes spread on Lake Michigan, right? But when I got back into Minneapolis the next day, and it was horrible. Like, I remember walking through the airport with a coat over my head. I thought everybody was looking at me like, oh my God, her husband died, which of course nobody's looking at you. And that's one of the things I've learned is, you never know what's really happening with people around you.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
but when I got home, my brother-in-law, my Woody's brother, actually came in from Chicago, and I said, "You know what? I know Woody doesn't want to be in a casket, but guess what? We are going to. He has to be in an open casket for at least the reviewal." And I had to with my because I'm like people have to see with their own eyes that he's dead. He's
Right.
dead. And I remember going over to the funeral home, and I know this is going to sound really morbid, but I need I needed to see him. I needed to
Mhm.
see him. And they pulled him out of like a bat, like, out of the wall, like you've seen
Right.
on those
Yeah.
shows, and they had him on a gurney, and I went and laid with him, and I had to say goodbye to him, and just have the conversation that I didn't get to have, right? But that was
Yeah.
what I needed, because I needed to see that he was gone. And so,
Mm.
anyways, but I've long talked about where you got to see, I got to have some friends that were widows, young widows, and one, her husband died suddenly, and the other one, he had a rare childhood cancer, and basically disintegrated in front of her. And we all started talking about it. I'm like, yeah, but you got to say goodbye, and you got to say the things, and you got to hear him say things to you about going forward. And then we all decided, you know what? It doesn't matter. Death sucks. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter. It just
Amen.
sucks.
Yeah, it
It just
does.
sucks.
And you're the only person that's important at that time to do what you need to do. And if it seems weird to other people, who cares? It's how you want to handle it.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
to hell with everybody else, right?
Exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely.
You're listening to the What About Grief podcast. We will get back to the conversation in a moment, but I wanted to remind you that you can write to us at the show with your thoughts, ideas, or a description of your own grief journey. We appreciate hearing from you, and we like being connected with our listeners. So please reach out to us via email at whataboutgriefpod@gmail.com. Also, if you like the podcast and find it helpful, please go to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star rating. Hit the subscribe button and leave a review. All of this helps us grow the podcast and helps new listeners find the show. And share the link with those you know who are experiencing their own grief. The goal of the podcast is to help those like us navigate the confusing emotion that is grief. Have you ever had feelings of regret over these 20 plus years as you've reflected on his death? Not that you did anything towards his death, obviously, but knowing what you know now in regards to the pharmaceutical industry and the doctors and what they prescribed. Any thoughts of regret?
Yeah, it's funny. I wish I would have taken a little bit more interest. You're adults, so you don't ever think. I mean, I know how many things I've taken. You never think a drug that you're given. I've never looked up anything on side effects. I never even thought about it because I just think I trusted, right? And so I wish
As I did too.
Yeah, I think that is the one thing I wish I would have done, is actually questioned, or really that idea of like the head outside the body. And the night that Woody was found, the coroner called and asked if he was on any medication. The only thing he was on was Zoloft. And she says, we're going to take it with us. It might have something to do with his death. Also, the front page of our newspaper that night had an article that said the UK finds link between antidepressants and suicide in teens.
Oh,
So that was that exact day that Woody was found. And so, I wasn't paying attention what was happening globally. Granted, it's a different time then. We didn't have all the social media and access to information like we do today. But that is one thing I wish I would have really taken a little bit more interest. And it's what I tell people now all the time, especially with antidepressants. And what I've learned is that when you first going off, dosages change. Those are the most at high risk periods. And I didn't know any of that at that time. And most people didn't, including doctors.
I'm coming up in July on Sarah's 3rd anniversary of her passing. And I guess my grief is still relatively young compared to yours, 20 plus years now. But can you describe kind of your grief journey early on? What was it like? And as you look back 10 and now 20 years, where are you with your grief?
Yeah, grief was such for me, I had only lost my grandparents, so I didn't really have a whole lot of experience with grief, maybe cats,
Yeah.
And so And being young, when I was 30, I was 37, everybody, and I worked in advertising, everybody wanted me to be back to normal. Like they wanted me to be normal. And I was never going to be normal. My life that I knew was never going to be the same. The life and all the dreams and everything that I had planned was no longer the family that I was going to have. In 1 second, I had to, like, my whole life changed. And I had to learn how to do simple things because my every day, I say this, even though everybody came and friends were surrounded me, my family, they go back, and even Wood's parents who lost their son, they go back, but my everyday life has now changed. And I know
Mm-hmm.
you can relate to that. And
Sure.
so,
Yep.
I think I look back and uh all I needed initially, like, it made no sense, even as the kind of person I was. Like, I remember that first night when I got back into Minneapolis, all I wanted to do was talk to somebody. I didn't really even want to see my friends or people who came to my house. I just remember like constant flow of people coming and everybody wanting to be my friend. And everybody was my best friend all of a sudden. But
Right.
then the only person I really wanted to talk to was a friend of my sister's friend who had gone through the same thing. Her husband died of suicide 10 years earlier. And all I kept asking her, I didn't even know her. I knew nothing of her, but I go, can I talk to her? Can I get on the phone with her? And I kept asking, tell me I'm going to laugh again. Tell me I'm going to love. Like, I just needed something to hold on to, that my
Right.
life would not, this is not my new normal.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and I remember one of the, even the days following, after we had a big memorial service, and I had all these lifetime or life-size photos of Woody in my basement. And I remember like sitting on the floor crying and like scratching my heart. Like I just kept scratching and crying to God, like, God, take my pain and use it. It does me no good. Take my pain
Yeah.
and use it. And I kept saying that as I'm watching this. And little did I know, that there was going to be something that came out of this, right? My
Yep.
advocacy that I did, but it was horrible. I had to learn how to go to Target again because Woody always went to Target. I had to learn how to pay bills because Woody did that.
Right.
And so, um, you know, heartache's real. And trying to relate, and people that would come up to you and say things like the bizarre things, and they just want you to be happy. And you're like,
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm gonna,
How are you doing? Yeah.
yeah, like, and you're like,
Yeah.
well, that's
Yeah.
kind of a funny, yeah, funny
Yeah.
question. But
Yeah.
um, so and I,
Yeah.
what also, like, in the early days, I'm really, really grateful that I was raised in a Christian home, you know, that I actually had to rely on my faith. And my faith was super, uber, uber important to me because I can't imagine, because I'm just trying to make, sense of it. I tried going to a suicide group. That was horrible because I'm watching people 10 years out and they're still like miserable. And I'm like, oh, I cannot have that as my life. So I started going to grief share at church. Like, so I
Hmm.
was doing I was like on it. And I feel like that's kind of a little bit of my personality of like, oh my God, this isn't like, I wasn't created to be sad the rest of my life. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, you speak a lot to people about grief, and what do you consider the most important piece of advice on how to deal with this uncontrollable emotion now after all these years?
Uh, for me, I would say my faith is really important to me, and gratitude. I have come to have a different experience with grief. Like, I still talk to Woody. I mean, 20 years later, I still talk to him.
Hmm.
And that idea that they're out of your life. But that is the thing I realize when we leave this earth, we take nothing with us, right?
Yeah.
It is like, and so it created this new kind of appreciation of what really matters. And then there's times you get caught up with just life again. You're like, oh, wait, no, this is actually what matters. You know, People, friends, and then there's friends that you're like, They didn't know how to handle who you are, the new you, or who they want you to be the couple that you used to be and you're not, so you don't get invited. You find new
Yep.
friends. I mean, so it's just like walking through, but I have to say that probably for me, the most important was, my faith and having amazing, like my friends and my family that just surrounded
Yeah.
me.
Who truly understood what you were going through.
Because
Yeah.
they lost, I look back and I'm like, my dad, I can't even imagine. My dad still to this day is a different. But he'll always say, "I'm so glad I was the one that found Woody and not you."
Mm. Wow. Yeah. What he must have gone through.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or still is.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, how long then after Woody's passing did you begin your cause to help educate, us, the public, and become truly a leading global drug safety advocate?
Well, it's funny. It almost became immediate. It was almost like
Mm.
an immediate response because there's something intuitively in the deepest part of me. The night that Woody was found, it made no sense, right? And so that was happening to me where I was just like, there's no way. And I remember going to that suicide group. They're like, he must have been depressed. I'm like, no, I'm telling you. And then,
Hmm.
so that night, my sister's husband, my parents called everybody over to my house. And he was there when the coroner said, oh, we're going to take this bottle of Zoloft with us. It might have something to do with his death. Well, my brother-in-law went home that night and Googled Zoloft and suicide. We had no idea that in 1991, the FDA held hearings when it was just Prozac on the market, and there were all these random suicide and violence acts. And the FDA held hearings, did nothing at the time. They didn't, Eli Lilly said they were going to study it. So my brother-in-law is doing the research. He's ordering all these books. Apparently, he didn't sleep for the first 3-4 nights at all because he was
Oh,
reading every book. And then finally after the funeral, and I kind of feel like, I was having my episodes and Eric was over here doing research. And when I was scratching my heart saying, use my pain, take my pain and use it. Eventually, like maybe 2 weeks after Woody's funeral, Eric comes to me and he goes, I think I need to show you some stuff. And I sat there and I'm like, oh my God, I think this is it. Like, look at this. And there were books, and we didn't know any of this. So that really became our mission. I like to call myself the accidental advocate. I never
hmm.
set out to do this work, but
Yeah.
it chose me. And I remember thinking, if in 1991, all those families that were there, if somebody would have done and gotten the black box warnings on it then, I wouldn't be sitting here today because we would have
Yeah.
known, right? Woody would have said, an antidepressant? Why are you giving me an antidepressant? I'm not sad or I'm not depressed. And
Hmm.
so that became our mission. Eric and I, we call it the Battle for Woody. We just started going out to Washington, DC. We met with the FDA, the head outside the body, and why that's super important is that we eventually had a lawsuit, a wrongful death failure to warn lawsuit. And we talked to, I didn't realize there were all these families out there, or lawsuits that were happening. At the time, if you remember Phil Hartman, who was on Saturday
Yeah.
Night Live, his
Right.
wife killed him and then herself. She had
Right.
just started Zoloft, and that was secretly settled with Pfizer. Nobody knew about
Hmm.
it, and they blamed her like she was crazy. And I
Oh,
remember
wow.
that if you go back and look at what was said about her in the media. And so it became our mission. But the head outside the body, our law firm out of LA, when we told him what Woody said, that he was laying on the floor. And I actually think in some ways that was a gift that he gave me because the or Pfizer actually had a document that was in their files that somebody from the South African agency, like the FDA equivalent, wrote to Pfizer's chief medical officer saying that they have doctors that are reporting patients on 50 milligrams, which is what Woody was on, saying that they were standing outside their bodies looking in. And Pfizer says, oh, that happened. His response back to the regulators was that
Hmm.
happens on all SSRIs. We don't know why, but they didn't tell doctors at the time. And so that really became our mission, met with other families. We were kind of the leading family that drove we were out there. Fallon ended up giving me 6 months off, and I was out in DC probably every couple of weeks, meeting with legislators, FDA, Congress. The FDA eventually had hearings, the same ones that looked almost identical except for hairstyle and clothing as the 91, and it was
Wow.
kids. And so that really, it was almost instant that. And then that also, and I learned something, that idea of calling myself an accidental advocate, I think that also helped me with my grief. Because, when somebody dies, and especially suddenly, or suicide, you almost go on this investigation mode because it doesn't make sense, right? And so this helped to make sense, and also purpose out of Woody's life and tragic ending.
And healing.
And 100% healing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, you've spoken in front of Congress and spoken to the FDA. 20 years, you've done incredible work. What has changed today in the pharma industry in regard to educating and warning us, the public, on the drugs we're prescribed and putting in our body?
Well, it's funny because I would say initially, we got the black box warnings on. It only went up to age 24, but a lot of the documents that I got out from the lawsuit actually show that all ages are at risk. And so that's one thing I'm always out saying, all ages are at risk, and they know it. So, I originally thought this was going to be all I did. Like, I did my part. I'm going back to my advertising life, all of that. And I quickly realized it's our whole drug safety system and how drugs come onto market. So in many ways, I think things have gotten worse than they were 20 years ago. And in the disclosure and how it's a business. And, I have spent my entire life and career in advertising and marketing. And it's really, I see marketing all over. And that's why, I now call it like acceptable collateral damage. People like Woody, and there'll always be people that will be harmed by product or killed by products. And that's just considered acceptable collateral damage. But, but for somebody like me and all these families that I met, those acceptable collateral damage or cost of doing business are somebody's loved ones, and so they
have a name.
They have a name and they have a life. And even if that's small risks that they'll be like, that's a small percent, when millions of people take it, that small risk becomes larger. But if it happens to you or your family, it's your 100%.
Just kind of winding up here. I picture Sarah kind of chuckling from above that I'm hosting a podcast similar to you. Like, this, who would have thought you were an accidental advocate? I'm sure you get this question all the time, but what do you think Woody would think of your cause? Because I'm sure he's very proud of you.
Thanks. I have thought about it a lot because, it's funny. Before Woody died, he always talked about, Kim, let's go they're going to put 2 cell phone towers in our neighborhood. And I'm like, no, Wood, are you kidding me? You're never going to win city council and cell phone companies. And he goes, I'd rather try like hell and lose than do nothing at all. And I feel like he's kind of laughing, and I'm still going to beat the crap out of him when I see him in heaven one day, because here, you left me with one of the biggest drug companies in the world, and you left me. And I think he would be, and I will get this question always gets me emotional, because I think he'd be really proud of who definitely. I am and who I've become. And I wish that this person, I wish I could see him and have this conversation with him face to face, because I'm a different person today because of him, and he gave me this gift. So.
Yeah. Well, you're definitely aggressive, and I mean that in a very good way, because you are so invested in this cause to help others and make us all aware. And through Woody's tragedy, you're doing unbelievable work. And I think on behalf of all of us who are listening, thank you.
Oh, thanks. I didn't choose it, but you know what?
Me either.
I know you didn't choose it. And I love, and I also kind of like this thought. I was just thinking right now, like Sarah and Woody up there, like, oh, I like this, having conversation. It's really important. And meeting new friends who would have thought, this would be something and yet grief is part of everybody's journey at some point.
Yep.
But
death, taxes, and grief,
yeah,
right?
I think that's what they've said. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Lastly, how can people find out more about what you and what you're doing in your campaign?
Sure. Well, they can follow me. I mean, kimwitczak.com is my website, and it's got a lot of my past work on there, as well as, podcasts and stuff I've done. And also, I'm on Twitter. Twitter seems to be a space for drug safety work. I'm going to start to get more active on Instagram. But I also have a Substack, and it is Acceptable Collateral Damage. And that's a Substack that I write about my work as well.
Well, thank you for taking time, sharing Woody's story and your story. And I'm on your side. I'm a believer in what you're doing. So thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I'd like to close this episode with a quote I read from a man I follow on Instagram by the name of Mark Lemon, a podcaster, publisher, and author of numerous children's books on grief. Mark's father passed away during Mark's early childhood. Here's the quote. "When a loved one dies, you live in fear of forgetting them. You try your hardest to hold on to every inch of their existence. So, when you need them most, when the grief hurts, close your eyes and remember them. Remember the abundance of love that they carry for you, the love that never dies." I believe what Kim is doing exemplifies this quote very much. She isn't forgetting Woody and the pain he suffered and eventually died from by taking his own life. I'm sure Kim can close her eyes and remember Woody's love for her, and now she is turning that love around into a passion to inform and advocate on our behalf. She is making a difference, and I applaud her. I hope you do as well. Lastly, we can all help prevent suicide. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline provides 24/7 free and confidential support for people in distress, prevention and crisis resources for you or your loved ones, and best practices for professionals in the United States. My thanks to Kim Witczak. What About Grief is available monthly on all major podcast listening platforms. Please follow the podcast as well as rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. The executive producer of What About Grief is Marcia Anderson. Logo artwork was designed by TED Studios. This episode was recorded at BAM Studios in Chicago. And lastly, feel free to email us at whataboutgriefpod@gmail.com.